What do you do when the government finds your hotel for a cybersecurity breach? We go to one of the top cybersecurity companies in the business, Ex Nihilo Management, with their president and CEO, Anglea Dingle. Today, we will talk about what happened to a major hotel brand that got fined more than $24 million for a cybersecurity breach, and what your hotel can do to protect itself from this type of incident. All this and more on today's Hotel Insider. This episode was brought to you by co-hosts. If you want to reduce hotel labor costs, increase upgrade sales, and increase your hotel's productivity, then give your hotel the power of co-hosts. For more information, visit cohost.io. Hey, what's going on? You know who it is? It's Bruce Jordan, and we're here recording another episode of the Hotel Insider. And today we have an extremely special guest, Anglea Dingle. Hey, how are you doing, Anglea?
I'm doing well. It's good to see you.
Same here, same here. You know, I usually don't do these. I usually don't do the streaming, but this was so important to me that I felt like I just couldn't wait, because after I see everything that's going on in the industry and how the government is cracking down on cybersecurity, I said I have to get this out here immediately so we can make sure that we are protected. So tell us a little bit about yourself, how you got started, and what made you take this road to doing cybersecurity.
Sure. So my name is Anglea Dingle. I'm the president and CEO of Ex Nihilo Management. We're a managing technology consultancy. We are based in Washington, D.C. I started out as a software engineer. My dad was in the military, and we lived in Ohio and eventually moved to Washington, D.C. And I can remember being in high school one day and somebody asked the question, what do you want to be when you grow up? It was kind of like, well, I want to be like my dad. So that's how I got into computer science. I pursued a bachelor's degree in computer science and a master's degree in management information systems. And my path to cybersecurity was a little bit different in that as a software engineer, I felt like we would build these solutions and the customer was never happy. So that was bothersome to me. So I started looking at, well, what's the real business issues that we're trying to solve with technology? And that eventually led me into cybersecurity, because cybersecurity is actually a business risk and not just a technical risk.
You know, I was looking at what's going on with cybersecurity, and you know, we do a lot, especially in the hotel industry, we do like a lot of government contracts, and even a guest would just walk in and show their ID and then let us know that, hey, we are with the U.S. government. This is a government credit card. Do not charge any sales tax to my room because we are with the government, please. And I had no idea that there was like another side to that from the cybersecurity side that we had to be in compliance with, or we would get fined and penalized and everything else up the wazoo. So, you know, I seen what happened to Marriott. I think they had like a crazy fine of like 123 million or something like that.
That
And
was a
I'm
big
like,
one.
yeah, I'm like, I don't want that to be me, because your average hotel, they can't really afford, you know, to be fined by the government, you know, even if it's just $100, you know, especially if it's a small hotel. So like what happened with Marriott, and like what would you do if you were Marriott?
Yeah, so that's a great example to talk about, right? Marriott, one of the largest hotel chains in the world. And even as you have conversations about cybersecurity, depending on who's listening, they go, well, you know, I'm not as big as Marriott, so why are we having this conversation? I think the important thing to understand about what happened to Marriott is the anatomy of what happened, not even so much, you know, how big it was, because it was on a huge scale for them. At the time in 2018, when they had suffered a data breach, it was the second largest data breach in history. It is not any longer, because there have been others that are larger than that. Marriott has been bumped down to number 4. But in 2018, if you can recall that timeframe, they had acquired Starwood properties.
Mm-hmm.
And so in that acquisition, they acquired Starwood's guest reservation system. And that guest reservation system had been compromised. It had been compromised for a number of years. Starwood was not aware of it, and Starwood, even once they found out that there were some problems with it, they didn't communicate that to Marriott. So what essentially happened is in 2014, Starwood's operating system on one of their Windows servers had not been updated properly. That created a vulnerability. that cyber criminals were able to exploit. Once they were able to get into the systems, what traditionally happens in a cyber incident is once a hacker or cyber criminal gains access, they don't do their damage right away because this is a money-making scheme for them. And they make more money depending on how much information they have at their disposal or how much of your data they have at their disposal, because they can then launch things like ransomware attacks to say, hey, we've got your data and we're going to charge you X number of dollars in order to get that data back, or we're going to expose you and damage your reputation. They use a number of tactics. So in 2014, they gained access to the systems. Starwood wasn't aware of it because they didn't have the appropriate cyber protections in place. So it went undiscovered through the period of time that Marriott was looking at doing the merger and the acquisition with them. And then Marriott, on top of that, didn't do the due diligence that was necessary to not only look at their financial systems and, the normal things that people think about when you're doing an acquisition. They didn't do a deep dive into that reservation system. So even throughout the process of the acquisition in 2015, Starwood had another data breach. Their point of sale system had a malware virus on it, and they also didn't detect that and didn't disclose that to Marriott. So now you've got two vulnerabilities that are in a system. When the acquisition went through with Marriott, that's when the hackers chose to actually, Marriott then discovered, it took them some time, but by 2018, Marriott discovered that those vulnerabilities were there. And they discovered it because they did have some security alerts that were running in their systems, but we're talking about a 4-year span that those hackers were in their system. So the way breaches work is they make, they get some form of initial access. They sit back for, we're talking 2-3 years that they sat in those systems. And they are looking at ways to understand the way that payroll runs, who has access to what systems, which components are connected to the other, how information goes in and out of the system. And in this instance, these hackers were able to determine that some of the data that they wanted was encrypted. They sat on the network until they were able to figure out how to unencrypt that. They were stealing the data and they were re-encrypting it and deleting all the evidence that they had been in the system.
Wow.
So that they were not able to detect it. So by the time that Marriott did the acquisition, Marriott's systems couldn't detect that the data was being pulled out of the system because it was encrypted. And so if you looked at it, if a piece of technology looked at it on the network, it looked like it was legitimate data that was passing back and forth. And then, what ends up happening after that are different breaches that they perform, right? So that initial Windows server vulnerability left them open to the point of sale vulnerability that happened later. And then ultimately there are financial costs associated with all of that. Marriott took a really, really big hit, right? I mean, as soon as they announced that the breach had occurred, their stock dropped by 5% when they made the announcement about that. And then they got hit with some pretty big fines. So they got their cost to try to recover their systems alone was over $30 million. You put that on top of the decrease in their stock price. There is a cybersecurity regulation that applies to any company around the world that most people will say that they don't have to follow. It's called the General Data Protection Regulation. It's based out of the EU, and it essentially says if you have any personally identifiable information about an EU citizen, you have an obligation to protect that. And if you don't protect that, you can be fined. So they got a $120 million fine under the GDPR program. And then in the United States, a class action suit was filed for $12.5 billion. Well, the Starwood's acquisition was a $13 billion acquisition. So now we're talking double their money.
Yeah.
Their reputation was damaged. They had to then pay out costs for people like me who stay in Marriott hotels to have some form of credit card protection and fraud protection. And that's still not enough. Once your client's data is out on the dark web, it's just difficult to recover from that. And so it can really damage your reputation.
Yeah, I agree. Like I noticed that, because those mergers and acquisitions happen all the time. And we have like a due diligence list that we go through the hotel and so on and so forth. Usually most people will never consider cybersecurity to be on that due diligence list before the acquisition happens. So let's say we have an acquisition. What would you do if before you even think about acquiring a hotel, or maybe just after you acquire the hotel, what are some of the steps that you think we should take as hotel management companies and hotel owners to protect ourselves?
Yeah, I mean, so you obviously first have to start with your own systems because you can create vulnerabilities as well. And then you look at the partner. So when you think about your own systems, I think one of the challenges that, and I'll say small businesses, small to medium sized businesses. So a hotel that is not as big as Marriott tends to look at cybersecurity and say, well, we don't really have that many vulnerabilities because we don't have a system that's as large and as global as Marriott's was. We don't have customers that are all over the world. We're in this one location and we've got our customer base. And so we don't think that's really a big issue. But from a cybersecurity standpoint, you need to look at your supply chain, right? So who is the vendor that provides, if you've got key card access into your guest rooms, who's the vendor that's providing that key card access? What point of sale system are you using? What phone system are you using? What HVAC system are you using? Target's breach that happened years ago around this time of the year at Christmas, that breach was caused by an HVAC vendor. They had a back-end access to their systems. That vendor didn't protect that access. That's how the hackers were able to get in. And, they took Target out of business during Christmas. I mean, they were still open, but no one was trusting shopping there during probably their busiest time of the year besides Black Friday. So for an individual or independent hotel owner, you need to be thinking about, what does my supply chain look like so that I can protect any of the relationships that I have with my third party vendors and or suppliers. And then think about the fact that as a nation, our adversaries want to get access to intellectual property in the United States. So if you've got a unique app that you use to check your guests in and out of your hotel, or if you've got this location that has something unique, those are all competitive advantages that a cyber criminal can use to either attempt to ruin your reputation or to hold you ransom. And ransomware is one of the most effective ways that companies get compromised. It is as simple as not changing your password or having the appropriate protection on, because all it takes is one time. And once they've locked your systems, if you then don't have any back-end protections, like backups that have not only been run, but have been tested to make sure that you're able to restore from them, then you're stuck with needing to pay the types of money that they're asking. And I've seen many of them, and the cheapest one that I've seen is $1 million in Bitcoins. So there's some basic cyber hygiene practices that any organization needs to have in place. We need to be looking at our supply chain, and then you need to be considering cyber security insurance. So that's for the hotel itself. Now, when you think about what you should be doing in terms of due diligence, if you're looking to do a merger or an acquisition, it's those very things. You ought to be asking the prospective company that you're going to acquire to provide you evidence of what cyber insurance they have in place. And if they don't have any cybersecurity in place, actually, whether they do or they don't, then you should be looking for some evidence of that, right? When is the last time that you ran a vulnerability test? What were the results of that? Have you had to pay any fines because you've had data breaches? What types of data breaches were they? When was the last time that it occurred? What internal processes or procedures do you have in place to protect your hotel as well as your guests from any type of cyber incident that may happen? So those are the kinds of things that pop up at the top of my head when I think about what happened with Marriott.
You did say cybersecurity insurance. For average, like what are the premium rates for that insurance that you've seen from a low end to a high end? For cybersecurity insurance?
So the premiums are based on the level of security that you have. Right. However,
so we're on the high end.
Yeah, well, they started about $12,000 a year, right? So in the grand scheme of the world, that's, I guess it's all relative, but that's not a lot of money. When you think about the average cost of a data breach, it's going to cost you about $100,000. For small businesses, the lowest amount of money I've seen is about $78,000. in response to a ransomware or some type of CEO fraud, which is an email that someone tricks you into doing something that you shouldn't do associated with that email. But the costs can run in the millions of dollars. It is a extremely profitable business proposition for cyber criminals. If I can hit 14 hotels or 14 organizations in one day and ask for $1 million in Bitcoins and get away with it, I now have $14 million in Bitcoins, and they're doing it every single day. They're just hitting companies that are not prepared.
Wow. Now, if you got that ransom notice, what do you think the hotel should do? Should they just contact you immediately and you take care of the whole ransom side, or do they actually have to tap into their cyber security insurance policy to pay out the ransom, or how does that work?
Yeah, again, it depends on what they have in place. So if they, a lot of times organizations have managed service providers, right? They're the people that are managing their IT. What we find most often is that those managed service providers are monitoring the hardware, right, in the network, but they don't necessarily monitor for cybersecurity issues. So they may miss it, which is what was happening with Starwoods, right? No one was looking for the cyber criminals that were hiding in plain sight on their network. So if you have a managed service provider, you will, and they are not currently doing those cyber protections for you, then you'll want to contract with a company that can do that for you, or partner with an organization, depending on the size of the hotel and the regulations within your given state and city. The federal government would like you to call CISA, which is the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency. It's a part of Homeland Security. If you watched the Colonial Pipeline breach, that was a ransomware attack where they asked for several $1 million. And shortly behind that one was the breach from the beef distributor. The Department of Homeland Security was not happy that they paid those ransomware fines. They'd really like to stop that behavior, because the more people that pay it, it encourages, the cyber criminals. They hone their craft, and they do it more often than they would have done it before. So they would really prefer that you not do that. So you need to pick up the phone and call a provider like us, right? And we will help you to try to uncover where the problem is. If you have an insurance policy, you definitely want to call your insurance company. I've got a little 5-step action plan that I can share with your guests if that's something that you would like. Read. If you think forensics, if you've ever watched any of those crime shows, you want to preserve evidence, right? So they want to know what was going on. If you're able to grab screenshots, or preserve if it's happening on a laptop or something like that, preserve that evidence, because they will bring in forensics experts that will take a look and see if they can find out the nature of where the problem occurred. I mean, we do the same thing. We use automated software tools that will scan those devices and determine where we think the problem is and try to close those vulnerabilities. We are collectively a whole lot more vulnerable than we really think that we are. We assume that we assume that when we buy a piece of technology or buy a system from a company, that they have our best interests at heart. But I think if you watch the news, you'll see that that's not necessarily the case.
They think Norton is going to protect you.
yeah, and it by itself, again, the challenge is that this is it's not intuitive. It can be expensive. It is most often a technical discussion. And if you've ever heard me speak anywhere before, I tell people cybersecurity is a people problem. Cybersecurity is not a technology problem. You can buy any piece of hardware that you want. So Starwood had hardware. They had software that was running. If you don't have the processes and the people combined with that technology, then you don't have a cyber protection program. And so it really boils down to people being aware that the risks exist and wanting to do something about it. And cybersecurity, it starts at the top. Leadership within an organization needs to set the tone that it's important. You need to model that behavior at the top of the organization so that it trickles down. You need to give people the training and the tools that they need to be successful in helping you to protect your company assets. And then you need to document those processes so that should something happen, it makes it much easier for a forensics team or a team like ours or investigators to be able to come in and quickly determine what's happening if you've got some policies and practices and procedures in place.
I think about like 200-room hotels, 300-room hotels. What can the fine be for some of these properties if they get caught?
Yes, that's a good question. So for GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulations, so if you have any guests that go and look on your website and make a reservation that are European citizens, it is a percentage of your gross revenue. So 4 or 5% of your gross revenue is what they're going to charge you for that fine. So when you think about companies like Microsoft, like I said, 120 million, not Microsoft, Marriott, 120 million dollars, and then there's a cost per record fee when you get
Okay.
a fine, right? So you get penalized per record, and that ranges on any given year between 150, $120 up to as much as 250 some odd dollars per record, right? So think about 200 guests, right? If you had 200 guests and their records were there, then you'd be paying that cost. I have testified in front of Congress about cybersecurity and the impact that it has on small businesses. My last testimony was before the CISA. DHS stood up that agency, so I'm really glad to have seen them make that progress. But I tried to help them understand the costs associated with responding to these data breaches are so extensive that 60% of the smaller businesses go out of business. So
Yeah.
you talk about a small hotel. If they're getting both a class action suit plus they're getting the funds from the GDPR, and now I want to say Brazil. I'm almost certain Brazil has created a similar regulation similar to GDPR. So again, if you have a Brazilian guest that comes and stays in your hotel and then there's a breach, you pay a percentage of your revenue to them, and that's on top of what you have to pay for all the others, right? So the cost to bring in forensics experts to try and figure out what the problem is, the cost to provide some form of credit counseling or protection for the individual guest, the cost to restore your systems because you still need to be able to run your business, right?
Yeah.
And then the cost associated with any kind of fines. And so even if you have a cybersecurity insurance policy in place, the insurance policy covers, so if you've got let's say you got a $1 million ransomware request, the insurance company, if you have the right policies and procedures in place from a cybersecurity standpoint, will pay that $1 million ransomware.
Mhm.
However, they're going to do forensics because they want to be able to protect their money. They don't want that to happen again. That forensics cost is not covered by your policy premiums. You're paying that cost as it is incurred, and that can run into $100,000 and $200,000 to bring in forensics experts.
Wow. Wow. All because of one little oversight.
Mm-hmm.
That is amazing. That
Yeah,
is amazing.
click the wrong link and it costs you a lot.
Unbelievable. Unbelievable. So tell everybody how to get in touch with you.
Sure.
Because I definitely want to make sure that they call the expert first before they find themselves in this situation. Nobody wants to pay $200 a record. Like you have hotels that have like a 100, 200 check-ins in one day. So I couldn't imagine, them paying $200 per record over a course of a year. That'd just be insane. It'll put
Mm-hmm.
them right out of business. So
Yeah, it definitely will. So again, my name is Angela Dingle. The company name is Ex Nihilo Management LLC. That is a Latin word, so it'll be interesting for people to try to figure that out. It's EXNIHILO. You can find us on the web at exnihilomanagement.com. So EXNIHILO-MGNT.com. And you can also reach us by phone at 202-379-4884. You can also follow me and or the company on LinkedIn and on Twitter. So Angela C. Dingle on LinkedIn and Twitter, and Ex Nihilo Management on LinkedIn and Twitter.
yes, listen, if you've never did any type of cybersecurity audit, if you're doing acquisition or sell or just if you feel like something's going wrong, if you got that ransom note, you need to give her a call immediately because she will be able to save you from your situation. But thank you so much, Angela. I really appreciate having you on the show. And we'll be definitely talking to you again soon, because I feel like there's a couple of things that key points that we may need to get back to, because I'm pretty sure we're going to get a lot of phone calls after this one, because nobody wants to be the next victim. But thank you guys for joining us again. You know who it is. It's Bruce Jordan, MJ Hotels. And this is another episode of the Hotel Insider. And we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.